Hello, Sober on Purpose family. So glad that you're here. I am bringing back Anna McLaughlin, and she's now running several things. She runs a podcast of her own. She considers a field as well as a group, as well as all other things. Wonderful, godly woman, raising kiddos, homeschooling at home. But there is another side. She left a high-powered career, and that's what I want to talk about today is as we begin to find our identity in Christ, we begin to realize that some of these things that have gotten us here are not going to get us there. So, Anna, tell us a little bit more about She Considers a Field, how that all came about, and this wonderful group of women that you're nurturing.
Absolutely. One of my favorite conversations with one of my favorite people. Tanya, thank you so much for having me back. It's great to connect with you. So She Considers a Field is an homage, a reference to the verse that says the exact same thing in Proverbs 31. She considers a field and she buys it. And this is really an invitation for women of faith who really have been, I feel they are called to walk in excellence, with deep purpose and deep devotion to their family. The idea that that we can be both things, that we can be very fully engaged and fully committed to our families, and we can also be in the marketplace in a way that's impactful and missional. How do we do that well? And that's where the rubber meets the road. As a former corporate lawyer, as a homeschool mother, blending these two things together has really been the work of my life for the past decade plus. And so I'm inviting others on for the wild ride that it can be. And that's the goal. That's the vision behind this conversation and the podcast that I facilitate.
Awesome. Well, and you said this has been the work of the decade. I mean, when we read Proverbs 31, and I have In Strength and Dignity behind me, which is 31:25. When we read that, we're like, how in the world? Well, she has servants, one. How in the world did she get all this done? What did she do? I love it that you said this has been the work of a decade. In fact, knowing your other interviews, I think it's been a little longer than that.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us, you had an Al-Anon experience. You had some things that you needed to let go of and write for yourself. Tell us what took you into that. And I'll do the spoiler alert. It wasn't being married to somebody with an addiction.
It wasn't. No. So for me, I had grown up with some trauma at some pretty pivotal points in my life. When I was between the ages of 11 and 13, I went from a single nuclear family, mother, father, brother, and myself, to my parents divorcing, my father's remarriage, my father's shortly after that, about within 2 years, diagnosis with cancer that was at the time terminal, like no one survived from this form of cancer. He was put on an experimental chemotherapy and he became paralyzed. And so during this very pivotal, you think about what's already happening in your body, in your emotions, in your friend group during that period of time from 11 to 13, and adding to that just this kind of cascade of destabilizing and really disorienting events. And at the end of that time, I was living exclusively with my mother. My brother had graduated high school, so I'd also lost my rock during that time because he was, through no fault of his own, right? He's just doing what we do. He's growing up, right? He's maybe allowed to do that. I think that's okay. So lots of changes, and it really resulted in me having very little sense of identity, knowing who I am. I was a Christian at that time, but I was not being raised in a Christian home. And so I was really just floundering through my early young adult years and found myself in my early 20s just kind of completely, there were no boundaries. There was no me that I could recognize. And I even remember as a young adult looking in the mirror and trying to there's this verse in James that says, it's like a man who looks in the mirror and walks away and forgets what he looks like. And I had that was my life. I literally would look in the mirror and go, I am only myself. Like I would have to tell myself this. And so very lost in my life. And I had a mentor who said, if you don't get in a 12-step group, I cannot be in relationship with you. So actually my own dependency on another person was the gateway into the rooms for me, but what a gift they were. I started with Codependence Anonymous, but Al-Anon was the most healthy and robust program at that time in the area. And thankfully, they were open meetings. I was able to come in. I found a lot of help because although I didn't have an addict in my life at that time, I had enough trauma that I really aligned with the support that Al-Anon provided.
What were you looking for from your mentor that had them say, I can't work with you unless you get X under control?
Oh, salvation, right? I mean, what what are we all looking for in life? We're looking for salvation, and we try to find it anywhere but God because, gosh, he's just so far away. Like one of my friends would say, "I need someone with skin on right now." And
Mhm.
I think there's, I was endeavoring to find wholeness and healing, but my walk with the Lord was not strong enough for me to cast all cares on him in a way that really stuck. So I would kind of I mean, I wanted it. I remember I would lived in an apartment. This was when I was in law school, and I lived in an apartment that had an upper deck up on the roof of the house. There's a swimming pool up there. And many times I would go up at night, no one was there, and just imagine that I was that much closer to heaven and go, "Lord, I want you to transform me." Like, I
Mhm.
wanted it, but I didn't have the tools. And that's what I love so much about the rooms is for those of us that are like, there's a gap between where I am and where I can see health and wholeness reside. The 12 steps says, "Here you go. Step 1. Here you
Mhm.
go. Step 2." And I just have so much respect and true gratitude for the rooms for that exact reason.
Absolutely, and here I want the audience to hear the backstory is you're in law school. You
Mhm,
did well enough high school, college, you're managing your own apartment, you're not
mhm,
glued to somebody trying to fix them, but you had somebody astute enough in your life to say, "Hey, there's something that's not here." And
mhm,
I think a lot of folks, we used to talk about codependency. Now we're talking about dependency, interdependency, prodependency. There's dependencies everywhere. A lot of folks would look at that and say, "You're doing all right." What
mhm.
what was really deep down in that made you say, "I'm not okay. I need more?"
Mhm. So I had deep self-loathing. Like I was I saw all my failings and really that the loss of my father at such a pivotal point. He was still alive. He lived until his 70s. I'm so grateful for the time that I had with him, but his presence was so lacking in my life. First because of the bumpy road that my parents' marriage was before they divorced, and then because of his illness and paralysis. And I remember my sweet brother, we're 9 years apart. He put together a photo collage for my dad's birthday when he turned 65 or 70, and he was like, "Anna, I had the hardest time finding pictures of you with our dad." And
Hmm.
it was so healing to me to just have that acknowledged of, yes, he was there, but we weren't together. And I just don't think it can be underestimated the wound that comes when we have that disconnection from a parent. And I
Hmm.
think it can be particular. I don't know that I could quantify it, but I feel like in some ways when the opposite gendered parent is not present, that can be almost more challenging. I had absences in both, but that one in particular, my dad's absence was so difficult for me to overcome. And so I did a lot of the looking for love in all the wrong places and had really reached a point where I had started to look to mentors to say, well, I want to grow with God. So I know that like just getting up, getting all in some boy's business isn't really going to give me the answer. So I was trying to kind of like force myself to be healthy, but I wasn't healthy. So what I mean by that was I would not date so that I wouldn't be unhealthy in relationships. But all that's doing is whitewashing the tomb, right? Like it's still
Mhm.
messy. It's just I'm not giving myself permission to heal. I'm just controlling. And
Right.
so that's how I would characterize my inner workings when I was at the height of my difficulty was that I was managing myself into health instead of truly healing. And the end of the road for me, Tanya, honestly, was I was suicidal in my mid-20s where it was like, I can't this house of cards is not holding. Just
Mhm.
and I spent a whole summer asking the Lord to take my life. And I said, I can't do this anymore. And I like to say that was the beginning of my love story with God because that's when I got real, which of course is when he was like, "Finally, now we can do something."
Finally, now I can see you. Now you've given me
Yes.
permission to
Yes.
walk in and redecorate. So,
Yes.
if I'm hearing you correctly, it was, I know I need something, and I've turned to men before. That feels really unhealthy,
Mhm.
and now I'm turning the mentors. That feels more healthy. Look at the protection that surrounded you.
I know.
It could have it could have been a lot worse.
Could have been so much worse.
Could have been a lot worse. But what I wanna bring out for the audience is this hole remained even as you're doing all these healthy things. You've
Mhm.
stopped dating because you realized that that was taking you away from God. You've turned to mentor saying, "I wanna go grow closer to God." One of them said, "You can't latch on to me.
Mhm.
I cannot be the savior for you."
Mhm.
And then you had to bare your soul for something that God already knew,
Yeah.
but you had to speak it out.
Yes.
I
That's
think
right.
that's super huge coming from what I understand and what I imagined, correct me if I'm wrong, is there's a whole bunch of pent up shame in
Mhm.
there saying, I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, my father wouldn't have behaved like, I mean, he had his own reasons for doing what he did.
Mhm.
And then the paralysis came along. When you were digging through that shame, how were you beginning to offer that up to God?
So, one of my first steps is gonna sound a little odd, but it was permission. Permission to do what I wanted to do to a degree. And so that started with actually watching episodes of The Wonder Years was the first step of just this summer. Because before that time, remember, I was in that place of, "I'm gonna do better," and so I was always reading nonfiction books and going to meetings, multiple meetings a week, and at therapy and different modalities of healing. And so there was this tenacious pursuit of there's something wrong with me, I'm going to fix it. And so in some ways my first step to healing was letting that go and saying, I can't do this anymore. I think of that hymn where fears are stilled and strivings cease. And
Mhm,
I think oftentimes when we're prone to addictive behaviors, sometimes they can be very acceptable addictions. And one of mine was self-improvement. I'm just gonna do better.
mhm,
I'm gonna do better. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. And that's how I ended up with that house of cards that I mentioned.
mhm,
So that was the first step was this kind of um life together with the father, where I just at first I was just watching The Wonder Years, and then I would, like, talk to God while I was watching The Wonder Years. "That's so sweet. Oh, what a beautiful story." And, it's a very idyllic if you've never seen it. It's somewhat nostalgic, the simpler time, simpler life, and so there was something very healing in seeing just in being in the ordinary instead of viewing myself as a problem to fix.
mhm,
So that was a big part of my healing. My husband coming into my life was kind of this next layer of healing of someone who enjoyed me, as I was saying before, with skin on. For him to just want to listen to music in the car together, for us to have an issue and just work it out by saying, oh, he would say, "Oh, that kind of hurt my feelings." And I would say, "I'm sorry." And then it was over. And I was like, what kind of wizardry is this?
Never experienced this before. Normally, we have to just talk about it and talk about it and talk about it.
Right, exactly. Like, we're not done until I'm in a puddle on the floor crying. That had been my experience before, and so to have
Right.
this man in my life who just really enjoyed me and liked me and then forgave me when I messed up was just a wonder, and so those were some of the layers of my early healing that the Lord really used. There were modalities. There was inner healing prayer. I had prayer ministers pray over me, so there was kind of this deeper spiritual work of this idea of I'm not performing, it's the Lord working in and through me. It's the Holy
Mhm.
Spirit transforming me. I think that that can be, especially if there are any folks that are more doers among your listeners, that can be very hard to step into and trust, but we don't have to necessarily understand it to give the Holy Spirit room to do his work. And so that was part of my healing as well, is to go, okay, I can't and he can. And over time he will.
How did you let go of the performance love? If I you're, you're in law school,
Yeah.
you're performing at a top measure, you're looking for self-improvement, and the skit guys who are Christian comedians basically is what they are. They talk about doing the dance to get the hug. When were you
Mm.
able to let go of doing the dance?
Mm. So I would say I like to refer to them as weak ankles, like the things that we kind of tend to gravitate back to. So in times of stress, I'm still right there. But what was so clear to me, there's a principle that the Lord gave me in a period of relational stress with our extended family early on in my marriage. And the Lord clarified to me this principle that I call hierarchy of covenants, which is it's not going to be mind-blowing to anybody in its principle, but how it plays out has been really helpful in helping me lay down that performance, which is our covenant people are God, and then our spouse, we entered into a covenant in marriage, and then our children. So my faith tradition, the baptism ceremony that we did with our children was a covenant ceremony. And so, and even if that the covenant language doesn't resonate, that's if we were to order our relationships as far as like amount of time, devotion, commitment, that's how they fall. And then other people. So when I'm in my performance mode, I am putting a lower order covenant, a lower order relationship above my higher order covenants. I'm prioritizing the many, what they think of me, over the needs of my spouse, over my devotion to God.
Give us an example of what would put you in performance and suddenly it's above God.
Mhm. Yep. So as an example, when and this was one of the reasons why I made the decision to leave corporate law. I actually worked for a wonderful law firm. They really cared about balance to the degree that they could, but it was mergers and acquisitions, which basically meant when one company was buying a piece of another company, it was all hands on deck until it was finished. And it's a service, and law is a service industry. So you show up and you show that you're worth your salt, and you show that you're worth the billable hour rate that's being paid. And so I would, well, the my favorite story, the one that still makes me laugh, is I was pregnant with our first baby, and I was having contractions because I was dehydrated and I was really
Mhm.
close to my due date. And I'm just sitting there at 2 o'clock in the morning working on an operating agreement.
Oh, no,
Uh-huh.
no. I would
Yep.
have been passed out with swollen ankles and
Yeah.
probably an ice pack on my
Yep,
face at that
yep, no,
point.
my colleague and I had a labor plan of what we were going to do if it turned into real labor, and we joked about it, and it was all very funny, but this was the lifestyle. It was a little bit of a hard driving, if you stayed up till 2, someone else had stayed up till 4. If you stayed up till 6, well, whatever, somebody stayed up a day and a half working on a deal, and so there was a little bit of that, that kind of ribbing each other, and you know, your discomforts were not very relevant to the
Mhm,
situation.
mhm.
And so that would be an example. Or I would miss my time to go home. I went 3/4 time for a period of time. They were willing to do that after my daughter was born. And I would the trick with law is if you don't do it, then it's not that it doesn't get done. It's not okay to just say to the client, "Sorry, like Anna had to go home at 3. It'll just happen tomorrow. Someone else picks it up. And so my nature, I couldn't stand that. I felt so guilty just leaving it on a colleague's desk because that means I go home at 3. Well, now he goes home at 10 instead of 9. And
Right.
so I would miss that time to go home to be with my daughter, and then she would be, and I was pumping, we were nursing till she was a year. And so then we would be I would be coming home at like 6 o'clock at night because I'd be in traffic. She'd be crying on the other end of the phone. I'm
Oh.
crying, and so um, and I just want to honor, like, there are seasons where that's like, I think that it can be challenging in a demanding job, and it can be challenging even with an hourly job, whatever, wherever you are in your work sphere, there are expectations. And so it's not necessarily that you're out of order automatically, but in the long term, we needed to look at our family values and say, this doesn't line up with the life that we want to create for our family. And so that's the work piece. But then, and this might hit a little closer to home for some of your folks, because it certainly does for me. If if an in-law, for example, were to just want to pop by or want to have a phone conversation and tell you how your spouse or your children aren't behaving in order, and we start to feel conflict or tension, where it's like, oh, he needs to change because my mom's upset, or because my father-in-law's upset. Somebody's upset that's a lower order relationship. And now I'm going to go to my higher order relationship and I'm going to tell my husband, hey, you need to fix this because my mom's unhappy. You need to fix this because you hurt my sister's feelings. We can actually get out of order in our relationships when we start to give more credence. Not that they might have a point, but if our loved ones start to feel kind of a competition, or like they're being pitted against by you and by a lower order relationship, that can start to get really tricky. So that's another place. And what the Lord taught me is, when there's that disorder, a boundary is needed. That was the
Mhm.
lesson that he taught me.
Mhm. A boundary is needed, and one of the things that the gospel says over and over again is don't gossip, right?
Yes.
And
Uh-huh.
in the sense of, okay, well, they wanna tell me all the bad things that are going on with my kids or my husband or whatever, it's really none of my business. If there's something that
Mhm.
really needs to be fixed, maybe as a parent, they need to come and say something to me, but if they need to say something to my husband, they need to say something to my husband. You're not
Yes.
having a relationship with him through me. You
Right.
have a relationship with him directly,
Mhm.
which you're exactly right about those boundaries of you the self boundaries
Mhm.
of I'm in a profession that is requiring more. I can't stay in integrity by leaving the document on somebody else's desk, and I can't stay in integrity by not going home to my child. You're in
Right.
that catch-22,
Mhm.
which with a family with addiction, we're often going, "I want it to look like this, but this is what's really going on." So we've
Mhm.
placed ourselves in that catch-22.
So
Now,
true.
as God is teaching you this in this season, and again, I want the audience to hear, she is struggling with herself and her choices and figuring out who she is, not trying to fix somebody else, but
Mhm.
looking at, this is still, I still need to find me. So
Mhm.
the biggest piece of when you can't find you is when you're blaming everything else outside. How did
Mhm.
God bring you back down to you again and go, "Okay, Anna, you have to do you." What does that look like?
Mhm. Yeah, so actually with Law, he brought back a tool that I had used in a prior dating relationship, which is, and this, when we were offline, we were talking about how we both really like Joyce Meyer, and so this was actually a Joyce Meyer little, encouragement that she had given. So this was probably 15 years ago now. She she was talking about fasting, and she was saying, essentially, if you're fasting food but you're gossiping about your neighbor, you might want to check yourself a little bit. And so she extended an invitation to fast criticism. And I took
Mhm.
her on. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to fast criticism. And so that was my work in the law firm, as well as, okay, for years He did 2 things. So for years, first of all, I had complained. "Oh, man, as soon as we schedule a vacation, then the work comes in. I think I'm gonna leave at 6. I end up leaving at 2 in the morning." Like, I thought that I would be able to go out on that date night with my husband, and then the work drops. And there was something very interesting about it. I don't know if it was spiritual or what, but there was that strange situation where what every time you thought you had plans, you no longer had plans. So my first work was acceptance. And my
Mm,
husband really helped with this. He said, every time I talk about the job, he said, "It provides so much for our family." I was a well-paid lawyer, I really was, and so that financially, it was a huge gift to our family. And so my husband would really underscore that, the blessing of my job and all that it gave us, while recognizing, he's like, "You don't have to stay there forever, but this is where we are right now." And so that acceptance of, first of all, may I see the gift? Let me see the
mm,
gift. Let me see the gift. And then second of all, um, there was a piece of me when I first started out where I kept thinking, if I was better at setting
mm,
boundaries, if I knew how to manage my time better. I was dealing with a disease called Graves' disease, which was a hyperthyroid condition. So my part of that is you can't settle your thoughts very well.
mm,
It's like ADHD on steroids. And so if I could settle my thoughts better, if I were more efficient with my time, and there came a point that was so healing before the Lord, of just accepting, okay, this is who I am today. Maybe not forever, but today I am a woman who has these health challenges that make it hard to focus, who is, has a strong sense of integrity and empathy, where I can't just kind of, say, "Sorry, dude, like, I'm out. It's 3 o'clock." And so that is that's not a part of myself I necessarily want to lose. And it's just, I haven't grown to the point where um, I know how to just, like, get it all done more efficiently. This is just where I am. And in light of that, this probably isn't a very fruitful job long term, but I'm here today. So how can I be grateful today? How can I sow blessing today? How can I encourage others today? How can I receive the gifts that God has for me? How can I stretch and grow? And I call it resistance training. Like, these are the times, friends, when you're feeling when you feel that rock and hard place where you're like, I'm in the catch 22. This is where 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So if you're there right now, I'm talking to you 15 years later, you will look back on that time and say, I grew so much.
mhm,
The Lord gave me so much. Okay. So that's the first piece that the Lord gave me. And then the second piece that was very interesting and has kind of led into my career now, which is as a life coach, is I had told anybody who would listen that I could never leave my job. And the Lord called me to faithfulness in one way. He said, "You are not to say that anymore. Shut your mouth. We're not saying that anymore." But he called me to flip it because it felt impossible. I was earning 3/4 of our family's income. My husband was in a trade profession. He was a CT technician. So he would earn 25 cents on his base pay was his raise. So he'd earn 25 cents, not like a quarter of a dollar on his pay. And I would earn a $10,000 raise. Like, this is real
yeah,
money that we're talking about, right? So it was
mhm,
huge to walk away. Um, but God called me to say, instead of saying I could never leave my job, you are to say, what if I could? And from that place, then we're in a space of creativity. Then we're in a space of wonder and curiosity. And now all of a sudden we're looking at opportunities and saying, what would it look like? How could I leave my job? How could it look different? And so when we're in those stuck places, we need to watch what mandates we're putting out there, what statements that we're saying that say this is how it's always going to be. They will never behave differently. I will always be here. Whatever those broad brushstroke statements are saying, our brains are very interesting. They listen to us, and whatever thoughts we are stating, our brains go, "Okay." And now all of a sudden, right, we're not looking for answers anymore. "Okay, that's how it is. Gotcha. All right, we'll always be there." And then when we shift it to a question, how might I be able to handle this more graciously? How might I be able to enjoy my life today? How might I find joy in this really difficult season? All of a sudden, our brains are at work going, "Okay, I'll figure it out. I'll find an answer. And then we
Right.
see a book on the shelf, or we hear a podcast from Tanya, or we're listening to a conversation at the table next to ours at lunch and somebody says something that blows our minds. And because our brains actually work for us when we give it a job to do. So that's what happened when the Lord trained me to ask the question instead of make the statement.
That is awesome. So
Isn't that
what if
good?
I could? If you're stuck in a place where you're dealing with somebody active in addiction and you're like, I can't set that boundary. I can't. What if I could?
Mhm.
What if I could?
Right.
And you had another one. Oh, I had to put on my glasses to see it. How might I? What if I
Mhm.
could? How might I?
Mhm.
So in those situations where that's really brilliant.
Right.
And you are talking real money. And that is but you're also talking real sacrifice on your
Yes.
part as part of being part of the family. And I know you have 4 wee ones now.
Yes. Yes. We just kept going.
You also made a statement a while ago on either a podcast or some Instagram, something that if the Lord calls you into rest, he will provide.
Yes.
So when
Amen.
the Lord called you out of this job, what happened?
Oh, looking back, it's so funny. I I am I cannot even tell you how we made it. But we did, and we're in a stretching season right now where we've got a piece of our businesses that's not performing well, where it's like feeling stressful. And I keep telling my husband, and then he'll take turns telling me, we're taking turns reminding each other, not one time did we miss being able to pay a bill. Not one time did we miss the opportunity to cover a medical need for our children, or a developmental need for them, or even being able to, still go on dates and things like that. And so it was very stretching. It really was. It was and I have so much respect for the people who make the plan and execute the plan and then they leave. We did not do that. And I think there was a lot of grace for that because this was a prayed over decision. We set, and this story just felt so archetypal of the time. So we wanted another baby, and my oldest was just over a year. And
Mhm.
the rhythm in our home was I would come home, I'd be home by 4 or 4:30. I would spend time with my daughter and my husband because my husband worked kind of an off shift job. And then the baby would go down at 6:30. I would work from 6:30 to 11 in this kind of like very
Wow.
unfruitful. Oh yes. Oh yes. I mean, I'd fall asleep, or my husband and I would have a conversation. Like, it wasn't as tenacious as it probably sounds right now. Yeah, I was working from, kind of just overload of I was still carrying this very full workload, and that was all I knew to do to get it done. And so, and it's kind of that conversation, I learned well how to work from rest after I left, right? Where I actually knew how to give myself permission. Did not know how to do that then, so I just worked constantly was my solution. So worked till about 11 or 11:30, and then my daughter would wake up, and she'd miss me during the day, and this is not uncommon for mamas that are gone, working during the day. She would nurse, she would cluster feed, and I would fall asleep in the rocking chair from about midnight to about 6 in the morning. And
Oh,
then I would wake up, put her down, and then take a nap for maybe an hour and get off to work. So that was our rhythm. So when we when we started talking about having another baby, I remember I was in and my husband was so sweet. He would sleep with the lights on in our bedroom on top of the covers in solidarity. Like, I'm not really
oh,
resting exactly.
so nobody's getting any rest.
Nobody's
Everybody
resting.
is exhausted.
Everybody's my daughter's cluster feeding, I'm up, he's up. I mean, just we were a mess, and the Lord's grace covered us anyway. So he's sleeping on top of the covers, all the lights on, just to show he's still with me, right? And I came in the room, I started kicking the bed in this very grumpy manner. And he
Yeah.
wakes up, and I'm like, "Listen, you want another baby? You got 9 months from conception to figure out how to get me out of this job because I am not doing this anymore." So that's
So
where we started.
so you guys got on the same page because
Yeah,
you
yeah.
said, "Here's a boundary.
Here's the boundary.
Not doing this kinda
No,
work,
no.
even though it pays quite graciously to do that."
Mhm.
And you're 4 in now.
Yeah, we're foreign now. So, yeah, so we, and so sorry, that was it just that story makes me laugh too much not to share and feel, like,
It's a
for
great
whatever it's
story.
worth. But so we left, and this was another piece of just me being me. I was like, "I can't take a maternity leave because it ended up being about $40,000 that they would have paid me, and then I'm gonna come back and tell them I'm gone, I just couldn't do it. And
Yeah,
so
not
my
ethical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my husband very graciously allowed me to do that. He said, "Are you sure you can't just think that maybe you'd return, but you really know I can't do it." I wanted to leave well. That was important to me. And so we left and we really didn't know how we were gonna piece it together. The amount that I earned was so great. It was such a huge percentage. But there was a tenacity in us that I feel like made up for a lot of what we lacked in income, we made up for in desire.
Mhm.
And one thing that we built that I think really served us well is we had a list of plan Bs. Here's our plan B, here's our plan C, here's our plan D, here's our plan E. And we set the table a little bit while I still had my big fat salary. We bought a rental property. That was our fail safe. If we need to, we're gonna move into that rental house that was a very yeah, yeah, we're gonna and then we'll
We
rent
were
out
with
our
you.
nice house,
Yeah.
right? And we just had it all. So I think that really brought the cortisol level down a little bit. It's just to know, okay, we've got a lot of options. Of course, final one is you move in your parents' basement, right? There's always that option
We
out
had
there
4 kids,
with
right?
4 children. Hey, only 2 at the time. We could have squeezed in, no
That's
problem,
right.
right?
You coulda done it. You coulda done
Yep.
it.
Yep. So, yeah, so that was it for us. I like to say we built the parachute on the way to the ground, and we haven't hit yet, so I think we're gonna make it.
So when you're looking at this and you are bringing in the trust factor, you and your husband were on the same page.
Mhm.
He's still saying, "This is a great job. Are you sure you don't want to go
I
back to
know.
this?" And you're like, "Nope, done."
Yeah.
Um, trust. How did you trust him? How did you trust God? How did you trust you're building the parachute on the way down. You could go kersplat.
Yes, yes. So I really feel like when you're at those moments, those crossroad moments where the you've made a decision, I think that trust, for me anyway, and maybe other people have more faith than I in this realm, but I would just want to encourage those that feel this way. You step what you where God meets us, and it's not uncommon for him to do this after we've already stepped out, right? So you think about, and I like the picture of Indiana Jones with the when he's going across that bridge, but it looks like it's the
It's not
chasm.
there yet. Yeah, it
Yes,
looks like it's
right?
empty.
And he has to just go all in for him to know that it's real. And I think that's what the Lord really like, that's where he really works. There's no way for us to trust him in those big moments until we're already in the big moment, right? It's like
Mhm.
we have to get out of the boat because if Jesus had said to Peter in that beautiful moment where the wind is roiling and the waves are going, and Peter says, "If it's you, Lord, like, call me onto the water with you." And Jesus says, "Come." Peter doesn't really know what he's gonna find when he steps out, right?
Mm-mm,
Like, he
mm-mm,
he he steps out because he believes the Father's goodness, but he doesn't know the waves are firm until he's out of the boat.
mhm.
And so, that's our invitation too is and I think that's what's so beautiful about entrepreneurship, about the recovery world, about any of these places where we're stretching into new spaces that are really challenging to us is this is where we come to know the Father's face in such a deep way.
Mm.
Because I didn't know that we would be okay financially until I tested the ground and it was sure. It's like I grew in trust over time, and he's okay with that. Like, we almost can't necessarily pre-trust. It requires the act of faith to then go, "Oh, okay. Okay, you came through." And then we just know it that much more for the next time.
Absolutely. Anna, tell us where we can find you all the work, your life coaching now.
Yes. All the
We'll put all
places.
the links below, but where can we find you?
Yes. So I have a podcast as well called She Considers a Field, and that's this conversation of how do we bring these things together. And I speak to homeschooling entrepreneurs because that's what I am, but I have a lot of listeners who are neither of those things, and they are just women of faith who really want to obey the Father's voice. They want to steward their lives well, and they're bringing together this sense of home and the sense of what is my service in the larger world. So I have the podcast. I have a website that connects with my coaching information, some guides that I've created, some other tools that have been very supportive for me in my journey, both with our financial stewardship, mental health, self care, all of those types of things. So I'll make sure that you have all of that information there. And I would just love to support your people however I can.
Thanks, Anna. I mean, the homeschooling piece, that's overwhelming. Financial, marriage, all those things. So hop in, join the links down below, join her on the She Considers a Field podcast. Always a wonderful time to be with you. Certainly enjoy being here.
Always love being with you too, Tanya. Thanks so much for having me.